Good morning and welcome to Sunday School with First Baptist Church of Greensboro. I'm Reverend Courtney Willis, and I am so glad that you are here to be with me as we study God's Scriptures together. This morning, or whenever you're watching at any point, we're going to be looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We've been spending a few weeks talking about giving and talking about what we do with our money. And we're going to keep doing that today as we consider the ways that we're encouraged to use our resources and give of them freely. So, the first question that I have for you this morning to think about is, what inspires you to give? And you can think of that in terms of financial giving, but it could also be things that you give of your time, of other resources or gifts or skills that you might have. But what inspires you to give? What motivates you to give? And maybe what external things push you to give? That's the first part. What inspires you to give? The second question that I would ask is, whom are you most happy or free to give to? So is there a type of person, a group of people that you feel most comfortable giving to? Go ahead and answer. It's really a two-parter today. Answer those questions in the comment section as we get our brains thinking about what it means to give. I'd love to see your answers. If you're watching on Facebook, you can type the answers right there. If you are with someone, you can share your answer. If you are by yourself, you can simply think of the answer or maybe write it down. Hope to hear what you have to say. What inspires you to give, and whom are you the happiest to give to? I think about how often we receive in the mail pleas or asks for giving, right? We receive things for people in need, for children in need, for hunger, for all manner of things, and maybe not even such maybe holy things as children or hunger, but we receive requests to donate to the symphony or to a political race or to some kind of nonprofit that is doing some kind of interesting work. We are bombarded with opportunities to give, aren't we? So I am curious, what are the things that spark that for you, that make you say, oh yeah, this is something worth investing in? And we're going to talk about today how Paul speaks to the church in Corinth about this very idea of the importance of what you are investing in. Sometimes we begin projects with great enthusiasm, only to put them aside as our energy for it wanes. So maybe you have a craft project. I know I have a handful, unfortunately, of cross-stitch projects that have been shoved in drawers or closets that I've not finished. Or maybe you have exercise equipment that has turned into a place to hang your clothes. Or maybe you have a new planner or calendar organizer that just sits half-filled. Or maybe like me, you've tried to start journaling or writing in a diary and that falls flat. The same can be true of our giving. What motivates our giving and what encourages us to give is something we have to consider, because our interest often shifts and it even wanes. So we have to think about how giving for us, specifically to the work of the Lord, can be sustainable, even if our enthusiasm for it is really up here and then it starts to wane as life goes on. In 2 Corinthians, Paul urges the church to complete the project that they started, to give the way that they began giving. Paul's relationship with the church at Corinth has been racked by conflict. By 2 Corinthians, their ruptured relationship has been restored, and Paul urges the congregation to finish the work that they had begun. And that is primarily their contribution to rebuilding the church in Jerusalem. Paul wanted the Corinthians to understand that the grace that God has freely given them should prompt them to follow Christ's example in giving freely to others. Now, for a number of years, this Jerusalem offering, creating the church in Jerusalem, was a major focus of Paul's ministry. Christians in Jerusalem were experiencing extreme poverty, perhaps because of the persecution they faced, perhaps because a series of failed harvests in the region. There are tons of reasons that could be. But regardless, Paul is asking this Gentile congregation in Corinth to contribute to the relief of these believers. And these would have been Jewish believers in Jerusalem. So alleviating the suffering of the Jewish believers was a big part of Paul's concern. But he was offering, he was also offering a theological purpose for giving. Paul hoped that this giving that he was inviting the church in Corinth to do would foster unity between the Gentile and the Jewish followers of Jesus. The Gentiles are giving toward helping the Jews, the Jewish believers, to have some relief from the poverty that they were in. Surely that would help connect them and unify them. By sharing their wealth, the Gentiles would show love, they would show gratitude for the Jewish believers and for the faith into which they had been brought. Jewish believers who accepted the offering would signal that they accepted the faith of the Gentile followers of Christ as genuine. So hopefully, Paul is thinking this would result in a unified Christian church collectively. Now, the Corinthians congregation had been collecting funds in an offering in response to Paul's initial request. Their early enthusiasm, though, waned, as it is wont to do, as they experienced both internal conflict among themselves and conflict in their relationship with Paul. So they started really excited to give, and as things shifted and changed in their own congregation, and as they started to have a little bit of a rift with Paul, it makes sense that their giving would start to wane. Now that Paul's opponents have been dealt with, and the church's relationship with Paul has been restored, he wants the believers to follow through on their commitment. Remember, friends, what I told you. Remember how I invited you to share in this offering before. Let's come back to that now that we've handled all the other stuff, is what he's saying. Generosity, Paul wants us to know, is one indicator of God's grace at work in us. And Paul wants the Corinthians to excel in their response to God's generous grace. So let's read together what this letter says, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We're going to read verses 1 through 15, so about half of the chapter. As always, I invite you to read on, read ahead, read all of 1 and 2 Corinthians if you want the bigger picture. We're just taking this slice of it today. So 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia. For during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For as I can testify, they voluntarily gave according to their means and even beyond their means, begging us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the saints. And this, not merely as we expected, they gave themselves first to the Lord and by the will of God to us, so that we might urge Titus that as he had already made a beginning, so he should also complete this generous undertaking among you. Now, as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness, and in our love for you, so we want you to excel also in this generous undertaking. I do not say this as a command, but I am testing the genuineness of your love against the earnestness of others. For you know the generous acts of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. And in this matter, I'm giving my advice. It's appropriate for you who began last year not only to do something, but even to desire to do something. Now finish doing it, so that your eagerness may be matched by completing it according to your means. For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. I don't mean that there should be relief for others and pressure on you, but it is a question of a fair balance between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need, in order that there may be a fair balance. As it is written, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. So, Paul urges the Corinthians to finish this collection that they're taking, first by pointing out the example of the church in Macedonia. So, I hope you heard what he was doing there. This is a long-time strategy to get folks to do something you want them to do. You point out what others are doing, how others are behaving the way that you want them to. And that's what Paul is doing here by pointing out the church in Macedonia. When we experience the undeserved grace that God generously pours out on us, it motivates us to give generously to others. And Paul is saying that's been the experience of the Macedonians. They faced intense persecution and deprivation, and they have experienced God's grace, and their response to that is to give freely. So it says in verse 2, during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity. Isn't that a lovely thought? Extreme joy abundant joy and extreme poverty caused them to overflow in their generosity. Y'all, we could spend a whole morning just talking about that sentence, I think. The idea that extreme poverty or extreme struggle or affliction or ordeals combined with abundant joy might only lead us toward generosity. And how inspiring is that? What an incredible inspiration the church in Macedonia is. So despite their affliction, their abundant joy, their extreme poverty has overflowed in a wealth of generosity. Mindful of their circumstances, Paul had not urged the Macedonians to contribute to the offering, but they did it anyway. In the Roman world, the middle class was virtually non-existent. Almost 70% of the population lived at or below the subsistence level, and the situation in Macedonia may have been worse. So it says in verse 4, they were begging us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to saints, despite their extreme poverty and the persecution that they were enduring. The Macedonians begged Paul for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the saints in Jerusalem. Motivated by God's grace, the Macedonians saw giving as a privilege rather than as a burden. They gave more than Paul even expected, even beyond their means, he says in verse 3. So I'm curious this morning if you think that being an excellent giver is dependent on the amount of money that you give. What determines, do you think, if one could be classified as an excellent giver? What would you say? How would you define someone who is an excellent giver? Go ahead and write that in the comment section or tell someone close to you. What defines an excellent giver? Paul goes on to tell us that the key here for the Macedonians was their attitude. The Macedonians' willingness to give themselves freely to God was reflected in their willingness to give freely to others. When a church or a people or a person experiences God's grace, they show grace to others. Our generosity in giving demonstrates that God's grace is at work in us. Paul hoped that God would do for the Corinthians what God had done for the Macedonians. Following through on their commitment to the Jerusalem offering would demonstrate the grace of God at work in them. Therefore, Paul sent Titus, whom the Corinthians knew and trusted, to help them finish their work. The Corinthians, we do know, were a wealthy congregation, and they demonstrated the gifts of the Spirit as we've talked about in previous weeks. God's grace was evident in their faith. Paul also says, God's grace is evident in your speech, in your knowledge, in your eagerness, as well in Paul's love for them. Paul hoped in verse 7, you are excellent in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in eagerness, and our love. So we want you to excel also in this generous undertaking. He hoped that God's grace would be evident in their giving. Now, the next section that we read, verses 8 through 15, in giving generously, the Corinthians would follow the example of the Macedonians, but more than that, they would follow the ultimate example of giving, and that was Jesus Christ himself. Paul says, even though Jesus was rich, and we obviously know he doesn't mean wealthy, was rich, he willingly laid aside limitations and weakness of humanity. He joyfully and willingly was poor in spirit, as the Beatitudes might say, poor in spirit for our sakes. He did not seek earthly gains. He did not seek material goods. He did not seek to be known and lifted up as a king. Instead, he belittled himself, even giving his own life on the cross. Jesus' grace was for our benefit. Through his death, we experience the riches of God's grace. Paul didn't command the Corinthians to give. It's really interesting to me that he says that. He says in verse 8, I do not say this as a command. And that's really important. It's not Paul saying to the church in Corinth, you must do this. But he is saying, I'd love to see it. He's saying, if you truly want to reflect all the aspects of who Christ was, it might look this way. I'm not going to make you do it, but it would be an appropriate and natural and good response. He urged them to follow Christ's example by following through on their intentions. Paul's instructions to the Corinthian believers included this idea of proportionality, that each person was to give according to their means. He doesn't tell them, you give until you are impoverished. He says you give until as you are able. So, I wonder this morning, we consider the idea of reflecting on the life of Christ as an impetus for us to give, or the grace of Jesus Christ as something that spurs us on to giving. How do you think our relationship with Christ does spur us on to excellence in giving? And what I mean is, what is the equation for you? What is your relationship with Jesus? What does it have to do with being an excellent giver? And I don't mean the collective you, I mean you. How does your relationship with Christ affect your giving? That's question one. And the second part of that is, how can you be more excellent in your giving? And I would, as you ponder those questions, I would offer that being more excellent in giving is not necessarily a result of simply deciding to be a better giver. I would suggest that being excellent in giving comes from a deeper knowledge and understanding and acceptance and gratitude for the grace of Jesus. And so it's not necessarily changing a number on a check that we write. It is saying, oh, I want to give more, or more excellently, more fully, maybe, as a response to my relationship with Jesus. And if you don't feel that you're able to do that, I would invite you to consider where your relationship with Jesus is. And I mean that in a compassionate way. I hope you hear that. If you're not compelled to give in the name of Christ, I would invite you to spend more time getting to know Christ. That's really what I mean. Paul returns to this idea of giving according to your means in this letter. We're not to measure the acceptability of our gifts by comparing who is giving how much. That is not what Christ asks us to do. It's not what Paul's telling us to do. What makes a gift acceptable is not what we don't have, but what we do have. Paul says that very specifically. The widow who gave a gift of 2 small coins gave a greater gift of 2 small coins than all of the wealthy donors, because it was all she had. In the same way, Paul wanted the Corinthians to understand the key factor was their willingness and their attitude in giving. Paul also wanted the Corinthian believers to understand the goal was not to enrich the Christians in Jerusalem at their expense. That's a really interesting part. He says, I'm looking for the verse. Maybe it's the next page. Sorry, y'all. There it is. In verse 13, I do not mean that there should be relief for others and pressure on you, but it's a question of fair balance between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need, in order that there may be a fair balance. It's not a question of relief for others putting pressure on you, but that your present abundance and their need should be balanced. The goal, Paul says, is a fair balance. At the time that Paul wrote, the Corinthians had an abundance. They just did. They were a wealthy community, and the Jerusalem church was in need. In the future, those conditions might be reversed. And Paul is saying, whoever has the abundance, it is their responsibility to care for those who are in need. When we think about the Exodus, we remember that God provided manna, bread from heaven, to feed the Hebrews in their wilderness wandering. The people gathered their manna every morning, and through God's sovereignty and provision, everyone had enough for the needs of that day. Whether that was a lot or a little, it was enough. God provided them with enough resources to meet their needs. During the Exodus, God provided for all through this miraculous provision of bread. Now, the Corinthians have the opportunity to provide for all through their Spirit-led giving. Their giving is an opportunity to participate in God's miraculous provision. Think about that again. In Exodus, God's self, provided manna, bread from heaven, sustenance, life, to those who were in need. Enough that they needed to get through each day. God, through Jesus Christ, through the early church, then says, you too can be part of this miracle. We see it in the feeding of the 5,000. Those baskets of bread and those baskets of fish that multiply, presumably out of the goodness of neighbor sharing with neighbor. And here we see Paul saying, you too can have a role in lifting up those who need more. Taking what you have, not so that you are impoverished, but so that you are taking your abundance and giving it to those in need. The Macedonians' willingness to give, in spite of their poverty, was evidence that Christ was at work in them. It wasn't because they were wealthy. The church in Corinth is far wealthier than the church in Macedonia, and yet the church in Macedonia has hearts that compel them to give of what few resources they do have. Paul wanted the Corinthians not just to follow the church in Macedonia, but to follow the example of Jesus Christ. As Christ gave himself freely for us, we should follow his example in giving graciously and freely to others. So your homework for this week is to consider a couple of things. One, what are some ways that you can give grace to others this week? And that might be financial, but it might be other resources that you have. How might your giving this week be an extension of your understanding of the love and grace of Jesus Christ? To whom can you show grace this week through your giving? Please pray with me. Oh God, we are a people of abundance. Even in moments when we struggle, even in moments when we suffer, we know that we still have more than so many do. Help us to draw close to you. Help us to be compelled by the story of Jesus Christ, by the sacrifices he made both in this life and in his death, so that we might be inspired, encouraged, compelled to give freely of all that we have, so that others might be lifted up. Humble us, Lord, so that others might see and know you better. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, friends, next week we're going to head to a different letter. We're going to be in Philippians chapter 4, the letter to the church in Philippi. Feel free to read ahead if you would like. That's what we'll be talking about next week. I hope you have a wonderful week ahead. Let me know if there's anything that you need, and know that I am so grateful for your presence. I'm glad to know that you're on the other side of this video camera. Know that I love you and that I am